welcome to the Design Rescue Show, where we take a behind-the-scenes look at the unique journeys of creative professionals, and we learn about the choices they've made that have shaped their career paths. Hello, everyone. Thank you once again for joining us today. I'm your host, David Block. Today, we are joined by presentation consultant and visual storyteller, Danielle Hennis. Welcome to the show, Danielle.
Thank you, David. Happy to be here.
First of all, before I start asking questions, I'd like to just go back and take a quick look at the roles that you've held in your career. And I have gone through, did a little research. I found that you've been a graphic designer, you've been a photographer, a presentation researcher, and an educator. And also entrepreneur as the owner and presentation specialist at Make It Memorable. Is that right? That
is right. Yeah. Excellent. A lot of different careers in my life.
Excellent. Okay. Well, this show is basically a behind the scenes kind of tour of your career journey. So what I like to do is we'll start back at the very beginning and talk about your education and how it influenced your career direction. So where did you first realize that you wanted to be a designer?
It's a great question. So in high school, I was in a high school that had a lot of opportunities. So there was a lot of art options. If you were in theater, sports, or science, they had like a ton of different options for you. And I definitely went heavily down the art track. But when I was a senior, a junior, and a senior, I was just incredibly burned out. I don't think we had that language at the time, but I was just very burnt out in high school. And so when it came time to kind of decide where I wanted to go, I had applied to colleges because that was what my parents expected of me. And ultimately I was like, I can't imagine going for another 4 years and studying still. So I looked into other options, and I looked into AmeriCorps, which at the time, I think they still do, that you can do it as a high school graduate.
Yep.
And I had gotten accepted into that. I thought I was going to do it. But then when my dad sat me down, I was like, this is how much you're making. This is how much it costs to live in the place where you're going. And you're going to come out the negative of $500 every month. And you can't work a second job, because that was something that they required with AmeriCorps, that you only worked their job. So that kind of fell by the wayside. And I ended up taking a year off, and at the time you couldn't stay on insurance. Like now you can stay on insurance till you're 27. At the time you couldn't stay on health insurance if you weren't in school. Right. And so my dad said, you can stay on health insurance, but you have to take classes at the community college for 1 semester. So I took a year off. I took some classes. And while I was there, I took classes in a whole bunch of random things. Like I had no idea what I wanted to do. I just was like, this sounds interesting. This sounds interesting. I'll just take all these classes. And one of the classes I took was graphic design, and one of them was psychology. And I really enjoyed both of them. And I really enjoyed the more like college structure of the classes as opposed to the high school structure of the classes. And I decided that was what I was going to study. I was going to study 2 random degrees that didn't relate. And I had told all the colleges that I applied to that had accepted me that I was going to defer for a year. And so when that year came up, only one of the colleges had a graphic design program by circumstance. And I was like, great, I'm going there. So I went to Appalachian State, which is in the mountains in North Carolina. And I studied graphic design and psychology and got a double degree. And when I graduated, there was a recession. So I couldn't get a job in graphic design because they didn't have any. So I ended up working a bunch of part-time jobs. So I had like jobs at print shops, jobs at a screen printing shop. I was doing freelance. I was doing photography. I was working as a bartender, and just kind of like mixing all these jobs together so I could survive. And that was how I started in graphic design. But then obviously as time went on, I got better at it too. Like I got a better portfolio, and the recession got better, the job market got better, and I was able to get a job in graphic design and worked in that full time for quite a bit.
Wow, that's interesting. That's awesome. So you got a double degree, a BFA and a BA. Did you do it? Was simultaneous, right?
Yeah.
It was simultaneous. Wow, not one after the other. That's wonderful. How challenging. That's awesome.
I'm never taking classes again too. I'm going to take all the classes all at once.
That's really interesting. So I'm curious how you build, how you use that skill, the psychological degree. Is that appropriate to say there, or
Yeah.
the psychology degree? I'll say.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So how do you integrate that knowledge into your design work?
Oh, so much. When I got it, it was mainly just like, I'm interested in this and I'm interested in this. So I'm going to do both. Right. And I think
Right.
for a period of time, I thought I'd go back and I'd get my PhD and do research in psychology because that's what I was really interested in. I didn't. And then I kind of happenstance worked my way into that field anyways by like circumventing the system. But regardless, I have found that psychology doesn't necessarily teach you here's how people process things directly in terms of design or in terms of presentations. But there's so much research out there that if you're willing to look into it and if you have an understanding of general like research methods and what the results are actually saying, like as long as you can read those peer-reviewed articles, there's so much information out there. And there are books that you can get that are design research books. There's not a ton of them, but like the one that comes to mind is There's 100 Things Every Designer Needs to Know. And she's a web designer, but she looks at psychology principles and how they apply to design.
Right.
And I find that like and there's a bunch of books on persuasion, which honestly design mostly is persuasion. And there's several books. Influence is like the first one that I ever read that it doesn't directly relate to design, but it's still helpful to know like how do you get people to change, because ultimately a lot of times design is a call to action, right? It's like to get them to do something, buy something, go somewhere, whatever it is, you're asking them to change. So that is really helpful. I think a lot of times that can really shift how you design things because you start to think about how people are processing it as opposed to what looks good.
Right.
And ideally you're combining those together, right? With presentations, I use it all the time. Like my presentation work is based on how people process information. So it's like how you present it in terms of the order of how you present it, how often you talk, how long you talk, how oftentimes you like break up the talking with activities, how you show information. All of that is based in psychology. And it has shifted also how I teach classes as well, because I think it's easy to kind of jump in and just be like, I'm just going to lecture for the whole time. Or I'm going to have to do a working class day the whole time. But ultimately, there's a combination of that works really well. Yeah, I would check out the book. It's really quick and easy. It's about this thick. It's really like a page or two about 100 things, and it's some of it's relevant, some of it's not. A lot of it's more relevant in like web design, but you
Right.
can take bits and pieces of that, right? And I think just what I feel like we hear a lot of times is the psychology of color, but that's kind of, from what I've read anyways, it's kind of impossible because every culture has a different way of
Right.
viewing color. And
Yeah.
so you really can't create this universal psychology of color, right? It doesn't exist. And but what I find interesting is that typefaces have been studied and not well, I would argue, because most psychologists don't have a design background. And so one thing that I think has been really prominent in the design field is that you use sans serifs for web or electronic stuff and use serifs for print. And there actually is no psychological evidence that makes a difference.
Right.
So I feel like there's been these things that like we've continued because that's just like, well, that's what's been told to us, but they're not necessarily based on any real evidence. And what we've seen actually instead is that you process, like when I first graduated, as I mentioned, it was in the recession. And I had a lot of graphic design projects that I, as a freelancer, just didn't have a full understanding of the process. And I feel like if you can, as a designer, if you can get experience working for an organization, you're kind of learning on the company's dime and it just makes life so much easier. So when I was freelancing, I was trying to do everything on my own because that's what you do when you freelance. And I hadn't really gone through the process of like learning all the steps properly. And so it was just a little bit more complicated than it was the second time when I freelanced. When I made my own business this time, I spent a bunch of time kind of going through the process of learning how to make your own business and processing of that. So I'd say, like that was one thing. I relied heavily on my network when I was freelancing at the beginning because I didn't have a network. So it was basically my family. And my mom, I believe, was my first client. She was working for an organization and the lab wanted a logo. And so I made a logo for them. And I remember I wrote up this like artist statement about my work, and her boss thought it was hilarious that as a designer, I had written up an artist statement. um, which, I mean, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But it just kind of goes to show that like I had this like BFA background in studio work, and that was kind of like how I approached design. Whereas like years later, I had more background in graphic design work and like how do you communicate with the client in that way, which is a little bit different, right? It's less about like I made this beautiful thing that you're going to love, and it's more about like this collaboration between the client and you, and how do you make sure that what they want to show visually is what you're creating. And it's just a little bit of a shift. Um, for presentation work, my very first, I'd say, client for presentation work, which was when I was still doing the workshops, it was this massive oral proposal presentation that they were giving. And just for context, basically the US government gives funding for nonprofits or research organizations to do something in various different countries. So this was in general East Africa. There was like a lot of different countries involved in it. Normally it's just one country or one region. But so in East Africa, they were making off-grid electricity, and they were basically pitching for $50 million, which I can't even conceive of. Like $50 million is just insane. And so they had this huge presentation that they basically had to make to ask the US government to give them this money so that they could do this project. And I had done one workshop, and someone in that workshop saw me and they were like, we need you to help us with this presentation. And I was not ready. I was like, I have no idea how to go about doing this. Like, I've never worked on this scale with this amount of money, with this amount of people. They were all subject matter experts. They were all like very, very knowledgeable. And therefore, they also always thought that their opinions were 100% right, and that there was like very little collaboration amongst them. So it was a very big project to get pulled into without any experience. And I was also not very comfortable in my own expertise, because it was like I'd done one workshop, right? Like I didn't feel like I really knew what I was talking about. So before before working with them, because I was like facilitating basically their brainstorming sessions to lead to their presentation, I read a ton of books on how to facilitate, how to communicate, kind of pulled together a bunch of questions to ask them. And in that first meeting, I did like a very brief overview of here's how people learn, here's how I would suggest that we make the presentation. And they were pretty resistant to it, because I think at the time I was still kind of a little bit in that this is best practice and therefore you need to follow this, right? As opposed to realizing that everything you do is a collaboration, and that like you can have best practice, but it's never going to line up that way, right? Like it's never going to be exactly the way that you think it should be. And that's fine, because it's a collaboration between you and someone else. And so there's a bit of resistance to that, because I didn't go into it with the right mindset, and they were resistant to shifting because they had their own mindset. And it was a difficult project to work on. But I think the biggest thing with that was just like learning to be more open-minded, learning to collaborate, learning to ask the questions as opposed to say what you think. So if you can ask someone a question to get them to shift their mindset, then it's much better than you saying your mindset, right? So there's kind of this like, and I do this a lot with clients in design too. If they're giving me feedback, and I don't understand it, or I'm kind of confused by it, asking the questions is going to be much better than you just saying like, I think you're wrong.
If you're enjoying this video, please take a moment to hit that like button, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you.
Yeah, learning to ask questions.
Yeah, excellent. Okay. All right. Well, so let me move on just a little bit here. I'm curious about your process. And I'm actually, let me rephrase that question. So you're currently an educator,
Mhm.
right? And I'm curious, how do you? Well, I'd like to hear about that. What do you teach, and where do you teach? And I'd like to hear how you go about teaching the creative process.
It's a good question. I teach graphic design at Wake Tech Community College, which is a community college in the Raleigh-Durham area in North Carolina. And I would say the creative process it's so pivotal in design, right? So it's pivotal in any sort of communication that you're giving at all, but especially in design, because if you rush it, then you're just going to be doing whatever the first idea came to your head is. And sometimes that idea is amazing. And sometimes it's not the best solution. And so if you don't spend the time to think through and brainstorm and question what you think is the right answer, then it's not always going to give you the best result. And oftentimes the first thing that comes to mind is going to be cliche, and it's going to be the same thing that 50 other people do. And once again, cliche is not necessarily bad, because it will be something that the audience picks up on right away, but it's not going to differentiate you. And so I think it's really important to think through, what is the purpose of this? So for example, if you're making a logo, and let's say you're making it for an HVAC company, so heating and cooling, the first thing that comes to mind is heat and cooling, right? So some variation of that hot and cold. So whether that's a flame, an icicle, or a thermometer, or any of those things, it's going to be what everyone else thinks of first. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that's wrong. It just means that you also want to do some research in terms of what other people in the field have also done, because you want your logo to look different than everyone else. Otherwise, the logo is not really serving its purpose. So I would say, thinking through how you can force yourself to brainstorm more to get more ideas. And if you come back and you're like, no, the thermometer was the best idea, then fine, go for it, right? But I oftentimes will have my students put a timer on, whether that's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, it depends on kind of what we're working with. And you have to be writing that entire time. So you have to be mind mapping, you have to be sketching, you have to be doing whatever it is, you have to be doing the brainstorming. And recently I read Quiet, which is all about how introverts process things versus extroverts. And one of the things that she touches on is that brainstorming has kind of become this idea that you have to be with other people and you have to you're coming up with ideas together. But introverts don't really process in the same way extroverts do. And so actually introverts do better when they're doing it alone first. And so I've kind of gone through that process of you have to create your own ideas first, and then you can get feedback from everyone else if you would like to. It's not always forced, sometimes it is. And that allows you to kind of get feedback on it. But you are spending the time creating the ideas, doing the ideation, and then slowly leading into the sketches. And if you don't spend the right amount of time ideating, then you're just going to come up with the first thing in your head. And so walking through that process. And I think of it kind of as a designer, the client basically gives you a ball of clay and says hey, I want you to make a mug or whatever it is that you're making, right? And if you decide that they actually don't need a mug, but they need a bowl, then you need to be very good at explaining why that bowl is going to be a better process. But if you make the world's best mug that you think is it's like this, right? It's great. It's perfect. And they're like, oh, actually, I wanted it to be like an espresso cup, 8 ounces or 4 ounces or whatever that is. That was just a miscommunication. And so it's also about asking the right questions at the beginning, because just because you made a mug doesn't mean that's what they thought you were making. And so kind of talking about how do you talk about what you think that the client is looking for? How do you reframe that? How do you ask questions? How are you actively listening? Because all of that really matters too, because if you go and spend 20 hours making the world's best mug and they wanted this, then that's not going to be what they were looking for.
Right. Right. That's really interesting. The way that I approach it the same way. I think it's super integral. It's very, very important part of the process. They have to follow the creative process. In my classes, what I do is I have a sign-off sheet. I have them start with research, go on to brainstorming and thumbnails and
Yeah.
refining, and then move on. And they get my signature with every single step of the way. So it sort of,
Yeah.
drives it
No,
home.
it's great. Because
So
I mean, when you actually get projects, sometimes the client's like, I have a budget for 5 hours, right? And so that might be that you then say like, okay, well, if you have 5 hours, then this is what I can do within that time frame. And
right,
you might have to skip some of those steps, but with the understanding for the client that like by skipping those steps, you're going to be getting a lesser quality product. And I would argue that with like logos or something that's really meant to be a branding item,
right,
you should be talking to them about like, if I create something and I don't do the research, then you might get something that looks exactly the same as a competitor. And technically then they can sue you to cease and desist. And so while I understand that that's not within the budget, I would encourage you to think about like what is worth spending money on right now, right? And kind of like explaining to them why that matters, because if you skip that research, that could be a lot of money for the client in the long run, depending on what it is that you're creating. Either it doesn't hit the target audience, so you didn't complete the task that they were asking for, or that you've created something that looks too similar to someone else, and then that becomes a problem later on.
right. Yeah, very good point. Very good. So we've actually reached just about the end of the conversation, and I just want to just say thank you once again for being here and taking your time to be a part of my show. I
Yeah,
appreciate it.
absolutely.
And what I'd like to do is my last question. I've got actually it's a two-parter. First question, and it has to do with kind of what you're doing currently in terms of presentation consulting. And so, I'd like to know for individuals that are striving to present their ideas or their portfolio or to talk about themselves, what advice would you give to offer them based on your experience?
Sure. So it can be a couple different ways, right? So if you are doing a presentation of your portfolio at like a job, the interview, they're asking you to present, which happens. It's job talk is typically what it's called, depending on which industry you're in. That's something that you want to show them how you work and that you are a little bit of your personality so that they can see like whether that meshes with the team. And with that, I oftentimes recommend talking about your process and how you got to where you are now with specific work or as a whole, and talking through who the target audience was, who the client was, why you designed what you did, and like what you learned from it. So especially at the beginning, I feel like those four things are pivotal because you're not going to do like every single thing that I've ever done. If I could go back in time, I would do it slightly differently. And so if you're not looking at that with that retrospective eye, then it's not necessarily showing me that you are growing, right? But most importantly is, do you understand the differences between the client and the target audience? Do you understand how to present to me, the client, and, or I guess in that case, I would be the target audience, right? Like to me, the target audience, if I'm listening to your presentation, how do you connect with me as an audience member? So doing some research on what they're looking for, doing some research on their organization, and talking to them with that understanding, because that's going to shift how you tell stories. It's going to shift how you explain your work. And so I'd say like do the work ahead of time, just like the creative process, right? Do some research ahead of time. Think about your target audience, brainstorm how you're going to tell those ideas. And that's still going to work in a presentation or your design, whatever it is that you're creating. And if you're the type of person that, gets nervous before a presentation, I always recommend, if you can, find ways to do some sort of like pre-presentation routine. So typically that is working off some adrenaline. That could be going for a walk. It could be doing some squats. It could be like squeezing your fingers or your toes or something else. And then work on kind of reminding yourself, if you have negative self-talk, that, it's not about success, right? It's about just doing your best in the moment and like reframing the expectations. Because if you think that you have to do 100% perfect, no one is ever going to be 100% perfect, right? Like it's just impossible. And so it's about like reframing your expectations, talking about how you want to just communicate what you've done to the audience, and that is going to be success in your mind, right? And so I'd say like thinking about being realistic about your expectations, going into it with having researched the audience and telling your story through a lens that they will be able to resonate with.
Excellent. Great. That's fantastic advice. And so my final question, looking into the future of presentation, I mean, it's been the same for a while, right? I mean, it's presenting your work has been pretty much the same. We've got slideshow presentations, pretty much that's how it's done. So is there anything that you can see as changing in the future? Is there another way to do presentation, or is it going to be this way forever?
I think a lot more storytelling has come into presentations, and I think that that is really helpful. So I worked with a in-house agency for an organization a year or two ago, and one thing that they were really wanting to work on is, how do I present my work better to the target audience or the client, right? How do I present that to our partners? And how do I also present that in a way that is a bit more persuasive? And the answer is basically storytelling. And so I looked at their previous presentations, and they had some great examples of storytelling in terms of like, this is where we are, this is the problem, this is what we worked on, and this is our solution. So you kind of make that basic story arc that you have in, that you've learned in English class. Like that's the same thing. And that can really transform how people see your work, because oftentimes I think when we present our work, we're like, here's what I did. Questions? And that's not really, like, you're not giving me any groundwork for it. Like, tell me why you did this. Tell me who you were making it for. Tell me like what the goals were, what the obstacles were. That's going to help me ground my understanding of your work better. And ultimately, I don't think it really matters whether it's presented in a physical form, whether it's presented on a slideshow, whether you're just showing like one image at a time, and it's just like you're pulling up whatever image thing on your computer is, right? Like it doesn't really matter. But the idea is, it's not just about the work. I think that's oftentimes we spend all this time and energy on making our design, but it's also about the process of how you went through it and the process of how you talk about it. And that's going to resonate with people more. And especially when you're making work for a client, you want them to essentially be persuaded that this is the best solution. And so you do that by talking about like, here's the conflict, here's the situation that we're at, here's the conflict, here's why this is that best solution, right? And if oftentimes with clients you get, I mean, in my experience anyways, I feel like you will sometimes get clients that they really, really want design X, and you're like, design X is terrible. Like design X is not a great solution. Design Y is where you should be going, right? And so if that's the case, you can think about how you present it. So either you don't present it at all and you're like, we tried it, it didn't work. Depending on the client, that may or may not work. But if it doesn't work and you need to show it, at least having 3 solutions and putting the middle one as the one the client wants, that's not the best solution, because we remember what comes first and last more. And so if you put the best solutions first and last, that's going to be what they remember more. And that at least kind of like downplays their idea or the solution that you didn't think was the best solution that maybe they were advocating for.
Great advice. Fantastic. Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Danielle, for being a part of my show once again. And I appreciate your time.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, David.